I thought he was inheriting an empire. He was actually inheriting a war. Dante Bellicourt walked into that reading of the will with his jaw set and his eyes already measuring the throne. 28 years old, handsome in the way that ruins people. Certain the way only men who've never truly lost anything can be certain. Then the lawyer read the condition: marry Serafina Vale, or inherit nothing. The quiet girl in the corner, the forgotten ward, the one he'd spent years looking through like she was furniture. He had no idea she was the architect of everything. If this story gets your blood moving, drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this empire reaches. Follow along, because this story is only getting started, and trust me, you will not see the ending coming. The rain started 3 hours before Lorenzo Bellicourte's body was cold. That was the kind of detail people in Rome noticed. The old ones, the ones whose grandparents remembered when the city belonged to men who settled disagreements in back rooms and sealed agreements with wine instead of paperwork. They said the weather knew. They said the sky broke open the same way it always did when the Bellicourt bloodline was about to shift. Like even the atmosphere understood that something was ending and something uglier was beginning. Dante didn't believe in signs. He believed in leverage. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the syndicate's upper floor and watched the rain flatten the streets below. The ancient stone going dark with water, the headlights of the car convoy smearing across the wet cobblestones like something wounded trying to drag itself forward. Behind him, the room was full of men in expensive suits doing their best to look like they weren't nervous. They were nervous. Lorenzo had been the gravitational center of this operation for 22 years, and now the center was a body in a mahogany box in the next room, and everyone in the building was quietly recalculating. Dante was not recalculating. Dante had already calculated. He was the blood heir. The last direct male line. His uncle had groomed him, or tried to, in between Dante's disappearances to Monaco, his gambling debts, his very public scene at the Cannes party last summer that cost the syndicate 2 political relationships and 1 legitimate shipping contract. Lorenzo had called him 3 times about the Cannes incident. Dante had sent flowers as an apology and not answered the 3rd call. I was thinking about that now, but only briefly. The point was, he was the heir. Whatever theatrical machinery Lorenzo had put in place, whatever legal constructions the old man had enjoyed arranging, it would resolve in Dante's direction. It always had. The world had a way of resolving in Dante's direction. They're ready for you. He turned. One of his uncle's senior lieutenants, a gray-templed man named Caruso, who had the permanent expression of someone swallowing something unpleasant, stood in the doorway. Caruso had served Lorenzo for 18 years and had never once looked at Dante with anything resembling warmth. Dante had learned to read the hostility in older men's eyes as a form of respect. It meant they recognized the threat he represented, even when they resented it. Then let's not waste time, Dante said. The reading room was wood-paneled and lamp-lit, the kind of room that felt like it had been designed specifically to make inheritances feel significant. The lawyer, a small, precise man named Ferry, who had handled Bellicourt legal affairs for 15 years, sat behind a desk with a sealed document in front of him. Around the room, seated in the heavy chairs arranged for exactly this purpose, were the people who mattered. Dante took the chair directly in front of Ferry without waiting to be directed to it. His cousin Victor sat to the left, one ankle resting on the opposite knee, the picture of relaxed indifference. Victor was 34 and had been in the organization since he was 19. He had Lorenzo's eyes, cold, measuring, the kind of eyes that were always building something you couldn't see yet. He looked at Dante when Dante sat down and smiled the way certain predators smile, with just the front teeth. "Dante," he said, like he was greeting someone at a party he hadn't expected to be crashed. "Victor." And then, in the corner chair nearest the door, almost swallowed by the room's heavy shadow, Serafina Vale. Dante's eyes moved to her the way eyes move to furniture, briefly, cataloging, moving on. She was 24, he knew that much. Lorenzo had taken her in when she was 8, after her parents, something Dante had never been given the full details of, and she had lived in the household periphery for the 16 years since. She was wearing an oversized cardigan, the color of old paper, her dark hair pulled back, thick framed glasses that seemed to constitute most of her face. She held a small notebook in her lap, and she was not looking at anyone. She was writing something, or drawing, it was hard to tell. She did that, he'd noticed over the years during family occasions. Sat in corners and wrote in notebooks and appeared to be only partially present in whatever room she occupied. He looked away. Ferry cleared his throat, checked his watch, despite there being a clock on the wall directly above him, and opened the document. Given the complexity of Lorenzo Bellacorte's estate, I will be presenting a summary of the primary conditions rather than reading the full document verbatim. The complete text has been provided in advance to all parties named herein. Dante settled back. Primary conditions. Fine. He'd reviewed the preliminary documents his uncle had filed 2 years ago. Standard inheritance structure, blood heir provisions, minority stake distributions. He'd read enough to know what the shape of this was. He had apparently not read enough. The Bellacourt Syndicate, including all operational holdings, financial instruments, property assets, and affiliated interests, is to be transferred to Dante Bellacourt under one binding condition. The condition is non-negotiable, non-contestable, and was notarized under separate filing with 3 independent witnesses. Ferry paused. The pause was professional and also somehow theatrical. Dante Bellacorte must marry Serafina Vale within 60 days of Lorenzo Bellacorte's date of death. If this condition is not fulfilled within the 60-day period, full operational control of the syndicate transfers instead to Victor Bellacourt, with Dante retaining only the minimum personal financial provisions outlined in Appendix C. The room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something has exploded and the sound hasn't caught up to the event yet. Dante did not move. He had a particular skill, developed over years of high-stakes tables and negotiations in rooms where any visible reaction was a wound. He could make his face do absolutely nothing. He used it now. He sat perfectly still and let the words sit in front of him like objects he was deciding whether to pick up. To his left, Victor's smile had not changed. That was more informative than anything else in the room. "I'd like a moment," Dante said, to no one in particular. "Of course," Ferry said. Dante stood, walked to the door at the back of the room, opened it, stepped through, and closed it behind him. He stood in the narrow corridor outside, alone, with the low sound of the rain against the building's exterior and the muffled voices of the men still assembled in the rooms beyond. He pressed his back against the wall. 60 days. Marry Serafina Vale. He closed his eyes for 3 seconds, which was all he permitted himself. Lorenzo had done this deliberately. That was the only explanation. The old man had spent the last 2 years of his life constructing a trap out of his own will, and he had constructed it with the specific dimensions of Dante's worst qualities in mind. His arrogance, his certainty, his refusal to take the quiet girl in the corner seriously. Lorenzo had known. He had watched Dante dismiss Serafina for years, watched him look through her, and he had decided that was the problem that needed solving, or there was something else. Something Dante wasn't seeing yet. He pushed off the wall and went back into the room. "Fine," he said. Victor's expression shifted. Almost nothing, a millimeter of tension around the jaw. "Good." Dante filed that away. Ferry nodded and made a note. Around the room, people exhaled carefully. And in the corner, Serafina Vale closed her notebook, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at nothing. She did not look relieved. She did not look frightened. She did not look, as far as Dante could tell, like anything in particular had changed. That bothered him more than anything else about the afternoon. The engagement, such as it was, lasted 12 days and produced 2 conversations. The first happened the morning after the reading, when Dante found Serafina in the mansion's east wing garden, standing in the leftover drizzle with a cup of tea, apparently unbothered by the wet. He'd come looking for her because it had occurred to him around 2 in the morning, lying awake in his room running calculations, that he should probably establish some ground rules before this became something it didn't need to be. She heard him coming, the gravel path, his shoes, and turned before he spoke. Up close, he was forced to recalibrate slightly. He'd been encountering her in peripheral vision for most of her life in this household, and peripheral vision had apparently flattened her. She was small, yes, but there was nothing soft about the way she stood. Straight spine, hands steady around the mug, looking at him with a directness that felt, for reasons he couldn't immediately name, slightly like being measured. "I assume you want to talk," she said. "I want to establish how this works." "How it works," she repeated, like she was trying the phrase out. "The marriage is a legal formality. We fulfill the condition, I take control of operations, and we maintain whatever arrangement you're comfortable with. Separate lives. You keep the household access you've always had, financial provision, whatever you need. Nobody has to perform anything they don't want to perform. She drank her tea. Rain beaded on the shoulders of her oversized sweater. And Valentina? She said. He didn't flinch. He should have. The question was sharper than he'd expected. The directness of it. The fact that she'd reached for the most uncomfortable part of the arrangement first. Like she'd been waiting for him to establish terms so she could identify the weakness in them. That's my business, he said. I'm asking because it will become visible, she said. And visibility affects your standing with the families. I want to understand how you're planning to manage it. I'm not asking for your input on how I manage my personal life. No, she agreed. You're not. She looked at him a moment more. I'll sign whatever Ferry puts in front of me. That was the first conversation. The second happened 2 days before the wedding, and it was 3 sentences. He passed her in the hallway outside the library. She was carrying 4 files and walking with the focused momentum of someone who had a place to be. He had been coming from Valentina's room and was still buttoning his cuff. They stopped and looked at each other. Are you going to be a problem? He asked. For whom? He didn't have an answer for that, which he didn't realize until she was already gone. The wedding was small, which suited Dante, and private, which suited him more. Ferry witnessed. Caruso witnessed. 2 other senior staff. Serafina wore a white dress that was simple and somehow impeccable. Not the kind of simple that comes from not caring, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and choosing not to require display. She signed her name with a steady hand and then stood very still while Dante signed his. And when it was over, she thanked Ferry, nodded to Caruso, and went to the library. Dante poured himself a drink and called Valentina. The mansion had 22 rooms. They occupied different ends of it. This was, Dante told himself, ideal. The first weeks of the marriage were defined by 2 things: the daily, unremarked evidence that Serafina was constantly working, and the daily, very remarked evidence that Dante was not changing anything about his life. He had meetings with the family's regional lieutenants every morning, overseeing the operational transition. He had lunch with Valentina twice a week, at the apartment on Via Condotti he'd been maintaining for 3 years. He attended the expected social functions, smiled at the expected people, settled 2 minor disputes among the family's northern contacts with the combination of threat and courtesy that Lorenzo had taught him was the most efficient tool in organizational management. He did not ask Serafina what she was doing in the library. He heard reports, through Caruso, who seemed to have appointed himself some kind of ambient monitor. She had requested access to the archive rooms in the basement. She had been corresponding with 2 of the family's accounting firms. She had asked Ferry for copies of subsidiary filings going back 8 years. That's fine, Dante told Caruso. She's looking at something specific, Caruso said. She's probably trying to understand what she married into. Leave her. Caruso left him, with the expression of someone who'd tried and could not be held responsible. The thing that actually cracked Dante's indifference open happened on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks into the marriage, when he came back late from a meeting and saw light under the library door at 1 in the morning, and on an impulse he didn't particularly examine, pushed the door open. Serafina was at the central table with 4 laptops open and documents spread across every available surface. The glasses were on. She'd taken her hair down and it fell past her shoulders, dark and disordered in a way that looked purely accidental, like she'd been pushing it back while she worked without registering that she was doing it. There were 3 empty coffee cups and a plate with half a bread roll on it, which appeared to represent dinner. On the closest laptop screen, a spreadsheet of numbers that would have been incomprehensible to most people, and which Dante, whose financial education was thorough even if his financial discipline was not, could see was a comparative analysis of quarterly transfers across at least 6 subsidiary accounts. She looked up. "You're still awake," he said. It was not a question. "You're back late," she said. Also, not a question. He came far enough into the room to see the screen properly. The numbers resolved. His jaw shifted. "Those are Victor's accounts." "Some of them," she said. "Where did you get access?" "Lorenzo gave me the archive codes 4 years ago." She looked at him with the particular steadiness he was starting to recognize as her baseline. "I've been monitoring the subsidiary accounts since then. Not all of them. Enough." Dante pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He told himself it was because his legs were tired. It was a long walk from the east entrance. "What are you seeing?" he said. She turned one of the laptops to face him. The spreadsheet was up close, even more precise than it had appeared, color-coded, annotated, with a side column of dated notations in handwriting so small it looked printed. She'd been building this for months, maybe years, maybe longer. "Victor has been running parallel transfers since approximately 3 years ago," she said. "The amounts are small enough per transaction to avoid the threshold flags in the standard audit system. But if you map the destination accounts," she pulled up a second screen, "they aggregate into 3 offshore structures. Total diversion over 36 months is between 40 and 52 million, depending on which shell transfers are confirmed." Dante looked at the screen. He looked at the screen for a long time. "This is documented?" he said. "Every transfer, every destination I could trace. The 3 I couldn't trace fully are marked in red. I have the source transactions, but the endpoint chains break. Someone built deliberate gaps. Victor hired someone good. He hired 2 people. I found one of the trails. The other one is very clean." A pause. "There's more." "Of course there is." She pulled up a third screen. "He's been making payments to a private security contractor based in Croatia. The payments started 14 months ago, and the amounts have increased 4 times. The current monthly figure would sustain approximately 60 to 80 armed personnel for a field operation." Dante went very still. "He's building a private army," she said. The silence in the room had a particular texture, the kind that comes when information lands so precisely that it reshapes what you thought you understood about your position. Dante had been running operational transition for weeks under the assumption that Victor was resentful, but managed, the usual dynamics of displaced expectation in family succession. He had factored Victor into his calculations the way you factor weather, as a condition, not a specific threat. He looked at the woman across the table. This small woman in her oversized cardigan, with her 3 empty coffee cups and her bread roll dinner, who had apparently spent 4 years quietly and methodically documenting his cousin's conspiracy, while everyone, including Dante, had looked through her like a window. "Why are you showing me this now?" he said. She considered the question. Not performing consideration, actually thinking about it, which he could see in the small shift of her expression, the slight tension at her brow. "Because the annual gathering is in 3 weeks, she said, "and I think Victor is planning to use it." "Use it how?" "Use it to establish himself. He has relationships with 4 of the family bosses that he's cultivated specifically since Lorenzo became ill. If he moves at the gathering, politically I mean, he doesn't need to win outright. He just needs to create enough doubt about you that your support fractures." Dante leaned back in the chair. "And you have something that prevents that." "I have something that ends it," she said, "but only if it's presented correctly." "Presented by whom?" She held his eyes. He understood. "No," he said. "Dante, you're not standing up in front of every family boss in Europe and—" "Why not?" The question landed quietly and sat there. "Because—" He stopped. "Because she was his wife who lived in the library. Because she wore thick glasses and said almost nothing at dinner. Because he had told Valentina just 2 weeks ago that the marriage was a formality, that Serafina was a ghost who'd been useful to Lorenzo's arrangements and nothing more. And Valentina had laughed in the particular way she had that made him feel like she was the only person in the world who understood the actual shape of his life. He couldn't say any of that. "Because it's not how this is done," he said. "How is it done?" "I take the information to the relevant bosses individually. Private conversations. Build consensus before the gathering." She looked at him with something that was not contempt, but was definitely not deference. "And when Victor hears you've been making private accusations, because he will hear, 2 conversations in and he'll know, he has time to discredit the documents, relocate funds, and position the private army closer to Rome before the gathering even happens." The logic was clean and infuriating. "You've thought about this for a while," he said. "I've thought about this for 3 years, she said. He got up, walked to the window. The city was quiet outside, wet still from rain, the distant light steady. He stood there long enough for the silence to stop feeling like argument and start feeling like something else. "I want copies of everything," he said. "I'll have them ready tomorrow morning." He turned. She had already gone back to the laptop, adding something to the spreadsheet with the brisk focus of someone who had decided a conversation was over. He left without saying anything else, which was, he recognized in the corridor outside, the first time in his adult life he had left a room without getting the last word. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to his room, sat at his desk, and started thinking very hard about what exactly he had married. The next 10 days were a restructuring that Dante hadn't agreed to and couldn't seem to stop. He met with Serafina every morning. This was how it started. He'd asked for the morning briefing on the documentation, and she'd simply been ready for it at 7 a.m. each time, coffee made, files organized, the kind of preparation that suggested she'd been doing this for herself for years, and adding him to the process required minimal adjustment. Within 4 days, it stopped feeling like a briefing and started feeling like a working session. She had layers in the documentation he hadn't fully absorbed yet. She had mapped not just Victor's operation, but the relationships between the family bosses Victor had been cultivating, who'd received what considerations, where loyalties were genuinely flexible versus performatively stable. It was, Dante thought, the kind of intelligence work that had made his uncle run one of the most durable criminal organizations in Europe for 2 decades. He started to understand why Lorenzo had trusted her with it. He did not share this understanding with Valentina, who called twice during this period and received shorter responses than she was accustomed to. The third call he didn't answer. He told himself it was because he was busy. He avoided examining whether that was the full explanation. The thing that changed something structural happened 6 days before the gathering, when Dante came into the library at noon and found the room unusually still. No laptops open. Serafina standing at the far window with her back to the door, looking out at the garden. He came in, noticed her stillness, almost asked something work-related, and then didn't. "You knew this whole time," he said instead. She turned. "Knew what? About Victor, about the money, about the army." He stopped in the middle of the room. "You knew for 3 years, and you never said anything to Lorenzo." "I told Lorenzo," she said. That was not what he'd expected. "What?" "I brought him the first evidence 18 months before he got sick. He reviewed it, told me to keep monitoring, and told me to keep it quiet." She said it flat, without inflection, not hiding the weight of it, but not performing it either. He didn't want to move against Victor until the succession was settled. He was afraid a fracture before transition would cost more than managing Victor's slowly escalating theft. And when Lorenzo got sick, he changed the will. She looked at him steadily. "He told me 3 months before he died what he'd done. The condition." A beat. "He told me I was the only person in the organization he trusted completely, and that he hoped the man I married would figure out why." The room was very quiet. Dante absorbed this in the particular silence he saved for information that required structural renovation of what he thought he understood. Lorenzo had known. Lorenzo had arranged this, not as a trap for Dante's arrogance, or not only that, but as a specific deployment of Serafina's capabilities, the one reliable anchor in an organization about to go through the most dangerous transition in its history. "He could have told me," Dante said. "He thought you'd take it seriously if you found out yourself," she said. "He thought if he told you who I was, you'd decide you understood it and stop looking." She paused. "He knew you very well." Dante did not argue with this because he could not. "He should have told me," he said. "Maybe." The word came out softer than her usual register, and something shifted in the quality of the room. Not warmly, not yet, but in the way that something rigid develops the first hairline crack. He looked at her face, the late afternoon light doing something to it, stripping back the functional blankness she maintained in working mode, and he registered for the first time, truly registered, not peripheral cataloging, that she was beautiful. Not in a way that announced itself, in a way that required attention to see, and that was somehow more forceful once you'd seen it. He looked away first. "The gathering," he said. "Walk me through the plan again." She walked him through it. He listened more carefully than he had the first time, and he did not interrupt. And when she was finished, he asked 3 questions that were precise and structural and betrayed that he'd been paying close attention. She answered them without any indication of surprise. That night, eating dinner across the table from each other in the manner they'd established. Present, proximate, not quite reaching. Dante looked up and said, "If this goes wrong at the gathering, what's the contingency?" She looked at him over the edge of her water glass. "It won't go wrong," she said. That's not a contingency." "I know," she said. "I know it won't go wrong." He watched her. The certainty in her was not arrogance. He knew arrogance intimately. He'd worn it his whole life. And this was something categorically different. Hers was the certainty of someone who had done the work so completely and so long that doubt had simply been displaced by evidence. He found, to his considerable discomfort, that he believed her. He ate his dinner. "For what it's worth," he said, when they were nearly done, and the room was going dark around the lamplight. "My uncle had good judgment." She set down her fork, looked at him. "In most things," she said. It was close enough to a joke that he almost smiled. He didn't, but almost. Outside, the Roman night was clear for the first time in weeks, and in 5 days they would walk into a room full of Europe's most dangerous people, and the quiet girl with the thick glasses and the notebook full of numbers would do something that would rearrange the architecture of the underworld. He didn't know it yet, but the empire he thought he'd been inheriting had never belonged to him at all. And the woman sitting across his dinner table, setting her fork down and reaching for her water glass with steady hands, had been holding it together since before he'd bothered to learn her name. The storm had been building for 3 years. In 5 days it would finally break. And Dante Bellicourt, who had spent his whole life certain he was the most dangerous person in any room, was about to discover that he had never once been right about that. Not even close. The gathering was held at Villa Serrano, a property outside Rome that had belonged to the Ferrano family for 60 years, and functioned, during the annual meeting of Europe's most significant criminal organizations, as neutral ground in the way that only places with very long memories and very thick walls could be neutral. Dante had attended 4 times before, always beside his uncle, always in the implicit role of heir apparent in waiting. He knew the rhythms of it: the formal dinner, the first evening, the working sessions the second day, the informal afternoon where the real conversations happened, where allegiances were tested and adjusted and sometimes quietly terminated over glasses of wine in the garden. This time he arrived as the principal. The difference was physical. He could feel it the moment the convoy cleared the villa's main gate and the assembled staff lined the approach. The shift in how men looked at him. The slight recalibration in postures. The weight of being the one everyone was measuring instead of the one standing beside the man being measured. He had wanted this. He had imagined it. It felt less comfortable than he'd expected. Serafina sat beside him in the car. She had done something different with her appearance for the occasion. The glasses were gone, contact lenses, and her hair was down and arranged with a precision that somehow still looked uncontrived. The sweater was gone. She wore a deep charcoal dress that was structured and quiet and communicated, to anyone paying the right kind of attention, that she knew exactly what she was doing. She had a single folder on her lap, closed, her hands resting on top of it, and she'd been looking out the window for the last 20 minutes of the drive without saying anything. "You're not nervous," he said. It came out like an accusation. "I've been preparing for this for 3 years," she said. "Being nervous at this point would be a waste." "Most people are nervous." "I know." She turned and looked at him. "Are you?" He looked out the windshield. "No," he said. She said nothing, which was somehow worse than if she'd called him a liar. Victor's car was already in the courtyard when they arrived. He was standing near the fountain talking to 2 of the regional bosses, Marsetti from Milan and a heavy-set Frenchman named Duval, who controlled significant port operations along the southern coast, and who had been, according to Serafina's mapping, one of Victor's most carefully cultivated relationships over the past 18 months. Victor saw Dante's car arrive and turned to watch him get out with the particular quality of attention that is almost physically distinct from ordinary watching: focused, still, measuring. Dante met his eyes across the courtyard. Victor smiled. The same front-tooth smile from the reading room. Dante smiled back, which required the kind of muscular effort that doesn't show on the surface, and walked forward to greet Marsetti. The first evening was architecture, everyone performing their position, testing the load-bearing walls. Dante moved through it with the fluency he'd been raised to have. Handshakes, names, the right questions to the right people, the right degree of deference to men older than him, and the right degree of confidence to men who needed to see it. Lorenzo had taught him this. Whatever else Dante had failed to absorb from his uncle's example, the social mechanics of this world were in his bones. Serafina moved through the same spaces and created a completely different effect. She didn't circulate the way he did. She didn't perform accessibility. She accepted introductions with a directness that was not unfriendly, but was also not soft. And she had a way of asking a single, precise question of each person she spoke with that appeared to leave them slightly more unsettled than they'd expected to be. He watched her with Duval. Duval, who was Victor's, who had to know something was coming, who was watching her with the careful attention of a man who understood that quiet women in criminal households were either irrelevant or the most dangerous thing in the building. She asked Duval about his daughter's medical program, which was apparently at a university in Lyon, and Duval's face did something briefly unguarded, something almost human. Dante clocked it. Victor was also watching. Dinner was long and heavily formal, the kind that functions primarily as sustained psychological pressure dressed as hospitality. Dante sat at the right position. The evening's host, Ferrano's eldest son, had arranged the seating with the careful diplomacy of a man who understood that placement was statement. With Victor 3 seats down on the same side, close enough to be visible, not close enough for easy conversation, Serafina sat across from Dante, between two of the older bosses from the Eastern operations, men who had known Lorenzo for decades and who would have treated her as an ornament at any previous gathering. He watched them, during the second course, shift from polite tolerance into the posture of men who were actually engaged in a conversation, leaning slightly forward, responding with more than the minimal courtesy expected. He could not hear what she was saying. He should not have found this as interesting as he did. "She's good," said a voice to his right. Pauletti, from the Venetian operation, mid-60s, with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 40 years deciding who to trust. He'd nodded toward Serafina. "Your wife. She's very good." "I know," Dante said. "Lorenzo raised her?" "From 8 years old." Pauletti made a sound that was not quite approval and not quite surprise. He drank his wine. "I wondered why he put that condition in the will. I thought he was being sentimental." "He wasn't sentimental," Dante said. "No," Pauletti agreed. "He wasn't." After dinner, the conversations migrated to the villa's long terrace overlooking the hillside, the night warm enough for it, the city a distant amber suggestion on the horizon. Dante found himself beside a pillar with a glass of whiskey he hadn't taken a sip of, watching the assembled geography of the underworld arrange and rearrange itself in the lamplight, and trying to calculate timing. Tomorrow afternoon. That was the window Serafina had identified. The informal session, when the formal structure relaxed enough for statements to land differently. Not as attacks, but as information that the assembled bosses could absorb and act on individually, which was significantly more durable than any public confrontation. He felt rather than saw Victor approach. Victor came to stand beside him at the pillar, also with a drink, also looking out at the terrace rather than directly at Dante. Two men watching the same party. "She's not what I expected," Victor said. "Who?" "Your wife." A pause. He swirled his glass. "I always thought Lorenzo was keeping her for sentimental reasons. She was a useful assistant, nothing more. A loyal pet." "That was a mistake," Dante said. Victor turned to look at him. "Was it?" The word carried something, a precision, a specificity, like it had been aimed rather than said. Dante kept his face level. "She's my wife," Dante said, "which means she's family." Victor looked back at the terrace. "I've been thinking about family a great deal lately. What it means, what it requires." Another pause. "Lorenzo asked a great deal from us both. He was not always fair in how he distributed those requirements." "He was fair. He gave you everything and gave me service," Victor said, still conversational, still looking out. 20 years of service. "I built the northern operations from a structure with 2 reliable contacts and 4 leaking revenue streams into the second largest contributor to family income. I did that, not because of blood, because of work." He drank. "And then he put a condition in his will that means I receive my own work as a gift from a man who spent last summer getting photographed falling out of clubs in Cannes." The Cannes reference landed with the precision it was clearly intended to have. Dante felt something tighten across his shoulders. He made himself breathe through it. "If you have a grievance about the succession, you can file it with Ferry through the legal channels Lorenzo established," Dante said. Victor smiled. Not the front tooth smile, something slower. "Of course," he said. "Of course." He walked away into the party. Dante stood at the pillar for another moment. Then he finished the whiskey he hadn't planned to drink. He found Serafina in the corridor outside the East Wing rooms at 11 p.m., coming back from what had apparently been a separate conversation he hadn't known about. She was carrying the folder. He fell into step beside her without deciding to. "Victor talked to me," he said. "I know. I watched." She pushed open the door to the room they'd been assigned, The principal suite, large enough to be uncomfortable in its implications about shared space, which they'd both navigated by unspoken agreement, and went to the desk. What did he say? Dante repeated it. She listened without interrupting, standing at the desk with the folder open in front of her. He knows we have something, she said when he finished. He's guessing. He's not guessing. He's telling you he's ready. She looked up. The comment about cons. That was a message. He's prepared to use your public record to establish you as unfit if whatever we present tomorrow gets contested. He has material. He's been collecting it. My public record isn't a secret. No. But framed correctly, in front of men who are looking for reasons to prefer stability over succession. She stopped. Say it. It could be enough to fracture your support, not destroy it, but fracture it. And fracture is all he needs. She closed the folder. We can't wait for the informal session tomorrow afternoon. That was the plan. The plan assumed he didn't know we were coming. He knows. Dante crossed the room, sat on the edge of the chair at the window, looked at her. She was still standing at the desk, in the dress that had done whatever it had done to the room all evening, and there were faint shadows under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping adequately. And her hands on the folder were steady, and she was looking at him with the particular expression she had when she was working through something that didn't have a clean answer and refusing to pretend otherwise. When he said, Tomorrow morning, before the formal session, I speak to Pauletti and the two Eastern Bloc representatives tonight. Now, if they're still on the terrace, and ask for a brief statement of context before the session opens. That's not standard procedure. No. Ferrano will have to agree to it. I'll ask him. He stopped. You've met Ferrano twice. 3 times, she said. The second time I helped him resolve a property documentation problem he'd been trying to untangle for 8 months. He owes me a professional courtesy. She said it without inflation, just inventory. I'll ask him tonight. Dante stared at her. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Dante. Go, he said. Talk to Ferrano. I'll handle Pauletti. Something shifted in her face. Not gratitude, not surprise, something more careful than either. She picked up the folder. The documents are in 3 copies, she said. 1 with me, 1 in the car, 1 with Caruso in Rome, who will transmit electronically if I send the signal. Even if Victor... She paused. Even if something happens to the copies I have, the evidence doesn't disappear. The sentence finished something he hadn't said out loud. Smart, he said. Yes, she said. She left. He sat at the window for a while in the dark room, listening to the muffled sounds of the villa settling around him. And he thought about what Victor had said about 20 years of service and a man falling out of clubs and cons, and he thought about Lorenzo building a hidden architecture of trust around a girl. Nobody watched while the men who thought they understood the empire's structure had been looking at entirely the wrong things. I thought about his own history, the weight of it, the specific texture of his failures, the ones that were public and the ones that weren't. And he thought about the way Serafina had said, even if something happens, like she was already prepared for that branch of the decision tree, like she had mapped the failure modes and distributed the insurance against them before walking into the building. He had never, he realized, been as prepared for anything as she was prepared for this. The knowledge sat in him strangely, not comfortably, not like something he had made peace with, more like a stone he'd just noticed had been in his shoe for a very long time. By 7 the next morning, Serafina had spoken to Ferrano, Pauletti, and one of the 2 Eastern representatives. Dante heard this from Caruso, who had driven through the night from Rome because Serafina had called him at midnight and asked him to be present. And Caruso, who had served Lorenzo with the particular devotion of men who understand that certain authorities are worth crossing geography for, had simply gotten in the car. The formal session was set to begin at 9. Ferrano had agreed to allow a preliminary statement, 10 minutes, before the session proper opened. Victor would not know until he walked into the room. Dante dressed in the suit he'd brought for this purpose. Dark, correct, unremarkable, in the way that allows the person wearing it to be the thing that gets noticed rather than the clothes, and went to meet Serafina in the corridor. She had changed into something he hadn't seen before, a dark blazer over a white shirt, her hair back. No glasses. She was holding the folder in one hand and her phone in the other, and she was reading something on the screen with the compact focus she brought to everything, and she looked, he thought, exactly like what she was, the most dangerous person in the building. Ready? He said. She put the phone away, looked up. Since 2021, she said. They went in together. Victor was already in the session room when they arrived, in conversation with Duval. He saw them. He registered Serafina's expression, not what she was carrying, not yet, but the quality of her certainty, the way she walked in like the room had been built for this. And Dante watched his cousin's face do something very subtle, a compression, a sharpening. Victor knew. He didn't know exactly, but he knew enough to know the shape of what was coming. Dante held his eyes as he took his seat and did not look away first. Ferrano opened the session with the standard procedural remarks, and then, with the economy of a man who had navigated 40 years of these gatherings, said that the Bellecourt representative had requested a brief preliminary statement and that he had agreed to extend this courtesy and that it would proceed now. Serafina stood. She opened the folder. And in the 12 minutes that followed, 11 and a half to be precise, because she was precise, she disassembled Victor Bellecourt's 3-year operation with the systematic, documented efficiency of a surgeon removing something that had been growing in the dark for too long. Every transfer, every destination account, the Croatian contractor and the 80-person security roster. The cultivated relationships among the assembled bosses, named by meeting and date and the specific consideration offered, all of it documented, all of it in copies now on the table in front of each person in the room. She did not raise her voice. She did not use a single word of accusation. She presented evidence the way a geologist presents strata. This layer, then this layer, then this one. Here is what that means. The room was completely silent. Victor sat across this table and his face had gone through 3 different expressions and settled on the one that Dante recognized from the reading room. The controlled stillness of a man whose next move was still forming. But beneath it, something else. Something Dante had never seen on his cousin's face in 20 years of knowing him. Fear. Not much, but there. When Serafina finished, she closed the folder and sat down. Paletti spoke first, not loudly. These accounts can be verified independently? Each transfer has a corresponding SWIFT reference number, Serafina said. The documentation was cross-referenced with the family's external audit firm before this presentation. I have the verification letter. She put it on the table. Duval was looking at Victor. Victor was looking at the table. The Croatian contract documents were sitting directly in front of him, his own signature on the authorization line, and he was looking at them like a man who has just discovered he underestimated the scope of a war he thought he was winning. Dante watched his cousin very carefully, because Dante knew something that the evidence did not show, something he'd understood in the terrace conversation the night before, in the precision of that Cannes reference, in the quality of preparation Victor had been projecting. His cousin was not a man who moved to the legal channels when cornered. His cousin was a man who had 80 armed personnel on a payroll in Croatia. And the meeting broke for lunch at noon, and Victor left the room without speaking to anyone, and Dante watched him go, and something cold and certain settled in his chest. It wasn't over. It was starting. He looked at Serafina. She was accepting the measured, significant acknowledgments of men who had just recalibrated their understanding of who she was, responding to each with the same level directness, her hand flat on the closed folder. Serafina, he said. She looked at him. We need to call Caruso, now. Her eyes sharpened. Why? Because Victor just became desperate, he said, and desperate men don't file grievances with Ferry. Her hand tightened on the folder, and outside the villa walls, somewhere on the road that ran between this hillside property and the city they'd both called home, a convoy that had been waiting since last night was already moving. Caruso picked up on the second ring. Where are you? Dante said. Villa Perimeter, East Road. Caruso's voice had the compressed quality it got when he was already in operational mode. I saw Victor's people move out 20 minutes ago. 3 vehicles. Direction. Rome. But they stopped 2 kilometers down and pulled off. They're waiting for something. Dante looked at Serafina. She had her phone out already, was pulling up something, the tracking application she'd apparently had running on the convoy vehicles since last night, because of course she had. They're waiting for us to leave, she said quietly. How many of Victor's security are in the villa right now? Dante asked Caruso. 4 that I can see. Could be more inside. Dante did the math. The villa had Ferrano's own security, professional, neutral, obligated to the gathering's protocols. Victor wouldn't move inside the grounds. The ambush, if that's what it was, would happen on the road. 40 minutes of open hillside between Villa Serrano and the city, and 3 vehicles already positioned and waiting. We need a different exit, Dante said. There's a service road on the north side, Caruso said. But it connects to the main road 12 kilometers out. If they have a second unit, do they? A pause. I don't know. Dante looked around the room. The lunch break had emptied it mostly. Staff clearing the document copies, a few of the boss's assistants moving through the corridors. Ferrano's security at the main entrance. Get the car to the north service entrance in 10 minutes, Dante said. Don't use the radio. He ended the call. Serafina was already moving toward the door, the folder under her arm. He fell into step beside her, and they moved through the villa's interior corridor with the specific quality of motion that is not quite running, but has running inside it. Controlled, directional, burning underneath. Ferrano's people won't interfere, she said as they passed the main dining room. Ferrano's people are neutral. They're not going to help us either. I know. If Victor moves before we're off the property, he won't. He needs it to look like an accident or a third-party incident, not a hit inside a neutral gathering space. She was right. He knew she was right. The rules of the gathering were the one structural constraint Victor couldn't afford to violate. Not after what had just happened in that room, not with every family boss on site and watching. He'll wait for the road, she said. Then we don't take the road. They moved through the kitchen corridor, past the startled faces of catering staff, and out through a delivery entrance into the thin northern light of the courtyard service side. The air hit cold after the villa's interior. Serafina didn't slow. Caruso had the car at the north gate in 9 minutes. They were on the service road in 10. Well, the attack came anyway. Not on the service road. Caruso drove it clean, and the connection to the main highway went without contact, and for 20 minutes Dante began to think the calculation had been wrong, that Victor had looked at the room full of family bosses with Serafina's documents in front of them and decided that the cost of a road ambush outweighed whatever he'd hoped to gain. He was wrong about that. They were 12 kilometers outside Rome when the first vehicle appeared in the rear mirror. A dark SUV, too fast, too close, the specific closing speed of something that had been waiting and had timed its entry precisely. Caruso said one word under his breath. Then the second vehicle came from the cross street to the right, and there was a sound like the world cracking open, and the armored glass on Dante's side went white with fracture lines but held, and the car lurched as Caruso floored it, and the rain that had started in the last 10 minutes turned the road black and reflective and treacherous. Serafina did not scream. She dropped flat in the seat, pulled Dante down by his jacket collar with one hand, and had her phone against her ear with the other. I need the secondary contact, she said into it. Her voice was, he couldn't process it in the moment, but later he would come back to it, completely controlled, shaking slightly, the way a wire shakes when current is running through it, but not breaking. Tunnel access quadrant 4, now. He didn't know what secondary contact meant. He didn't know about quadrant 4. He was beginning to understand that there were entire operational layers Serafina had built that he had not been shown yet. Caruso took a hard left onto a road. Dante didn't recognize, not a road technically, more a maintained lane that ran between old warehouse properties on the city's industrial south edge, and the pursuing vehicles lost them for 30 seconds, then found them again, and the second impact was lower, taking the rear quarter panel, and the car fishtailed on the wet stone, and Caruso corrected with the reflexive precision of someone who'd trained for exactly this, and they kept moving. The entrance to the tunnel was a steel door set into what looked like a retaining wall, built decades ago into the infrastructure of a neighborhood that had been industrial for most of the century. Serafina was out of the car before it fully stopped, running to a keypad embedded in the wall that had no visible markings, entering a code from memory. The door moved, heavy, slow, the groan of machinery that was old but maintained. Move, she said. They moved. The safe house was 2 levels below street grade, accessed through 300 meters of tunnel that smelled of stone and standing water and decades of careful disuse. Caruso brought flashlights from the car's emergency kit. Serafina moved through the dark like she'd walked it before, which she had. Dante understood that now, understood that she'd been here, that this was another piece of the architecture Lorenzo had built, and she had maintained, and nobody, not Dante, not Victor, not anyone in the organization's operational structure, had known about. The space itself was larger than expected. Generators, dormant but intact. A kitchen with sealed supplies. Medical kit. Communications equipment that was older but functional. 2 rooms with cots. The whole thing had the quality of something built for exactly this. Not a temporary refuge, but a designed contingency, the kind that gets prepared by people who understand that the worst outcomes need infrastructure. Caruso secured the tunnel entrance. Serafina went immediately to the communications equipment, began working through the startup sequence. Dante sat down on a cot. He became aware, in the specific stillness of the space after 40 minutes of sustained adrenaline, that his left side hurt. He looked down. His jacket was dark along the left flank, darker than the fabric's base color. He touched it. His hand came away wet. Dante. Serafina's voice, sharp, from across the room. It's minor, he said. Let me see it. It's... Sit still. She crossed the room and pushed his jacket back, pulled his shirt from his waistband. The wound was not minor exactly, but not catastrophic. A fragment, glass or metal, he couldn't tell which, had opened a gash along his lower left side during one of the impacts. It had been bleeding steadily into his jacket for the last 20 minutes without him registering it properly. She found the medical kit without asking Caruso where it was. Cut his shirt back from the wound with a pair of surgical scissors that were in the kit as though she'd packed it herself. Cleaned it with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had done this before, which he was past being surprised by. It hurt. He made himself breathe steadily. You knew this place, he said. Yes. Lorenzo. He showed me when I was 19, told me to memorize the codes. Her hands were steady on the wound. He said there would be a time I'd need it. Did he tell you it would be this? A pause. She was threading a suture needle with the particular focused frown of someone doing a technical task that requires exactness. He told me the transition would be violent, she said. He told me Victor would not accept the legal outcome. She looked up briefly, then back to the needle. He told me to keep you alive if I could. Dante looked at the top of her head, bent over her work. He said that. Yes. Keep me alive. You specifically. She made the first suture. He flinched involuntarily. He said, and I'm giving you the exact words, Dante is careless with himself because nobody has ever required him not to be. Change that. She made the second suture. I'm changing it. The wound pulled. He breathed through it. That's not... He stopped. What? That's not a small thing he asked you to do. She didn't answer immediately. She was focused on the sutures, counting them, maintaining the precise tension. He watched her hands work and thought about a 19-year-old girl being shown a tunnel beneath the city and memorizing the codes and carrying the weight of contingency planning for a decade and a half. While the man she was apparently supposed to keep alive spent those years performing his invulnerability in public and never once asking who was holding the infrastructure together. No, she said finally. It wasn't small. She tied off the final suture and pressed gauze to the wound and taped it. Done. She sat back. They were very close in the small light of the medical kit. Close enough that he could see the specific strain around her eyes that she had been managing since the car. The controlled tension of someone who had taken a genuine hit of fear and was still metabolizing it while keeping everything functional. Her dress was damp from the rain. There was a small cut on her left hand that she apparently hadn't registered, blood dried at the edge of it. Your hand, he said. She looked at it like she was noticing it for the first time. He took the kit, cleaned the cut without asking, applied a bandage. She let him. They did not look at each other while he did it. Caruso, Dante said, loudly enough to carry across the room. Here. What's the communication status? I've got a secure line to 2 of the Rome contacts, working on the 3rd. A pause. There's something else. The quality of the pause was wrong. Say it, Dante said. Caruso crossed the room. He held out his phone. A message on the screen from one of the Rome contacts, time-stamped 18 minutes ago while they'd been in the car. Dante read it. He read it again. The message was 6 sentences. The substance of it was this. While Dante and Serafina had been at Villa Serrano, Victor's people had moved on the Rome headquarters. Not violently, legally, technically, using a secondary provision in the syndicate's organizational charter that allowed for emergency leadership transfer in circumstances of incapacitation. Victor had filed the paperwork that morning, before the gathering session, timed to execute while they were out of the city. The fourth sentence was the one that mattered. The filing was supported by notarized testimony from Victor Moreau, confirming D. Bellecourt's long-standing substance dependency and operational incapacity. Dante did not move. Valentina. He sat with the phone in his hand and felt the shape of it, the timeline of it, the architecture of it. How long she'd been building the testimony while he'd been calling her back from meetings and shortening conversations and not answering the third call. How long she'd been talking to Victor. The specific usefulness of a woman who had spent 3 years in intimate proximity to a man whose every failure and indulgence and careless self-destruction she could catalog with the authority of a witness. He had given her everything she needed, and he had not even been watching. Dante, Serafina said. He put the phone down on the cot. He had known Valentina for 3 years. He had believed, not that he had examined the belief, because he had not, because he had never required himself to examine the things he was comfortable with, that she was loyal in the specific way of people who benefit from proximity to power, that her loyalty was structural, self-interested, stable. He had not asked more of it than that because he had not considered that it could be turned, that Victor could offer something that reoriented it, that 3 years of watching him dismiss every consequence and disappear when things became difficult had perhaps created a different calculation in her. He had not been watching. He had never been watching the right things. The filing, he said. His voice came out level, which surprised him. Is it legally executable? The charter provision exists, Serafina said. She had moved to the communications equipment, was already pulling something up. Lorenzo included it for genuine incapacitation scenarios. Victor's attorneys will have structured the filing to satisfy the threshold. Her jaw was tight. With Valentina's testimony, it meets the prima facie standard. Can we contest it? Yes, but not from down here. She looked up. From here, we look incapacitated. Every hour we're underground, the filing gets stronger. How long do we have? Before it becomes practically irreversible with the family bosses? 48 hours, maybe 60. She held his eyes. Victor will declare you dead. He'll do it within 24 hours. It simplifies the legal position, and it's cleaner than a contested incapacitation. Once the death declaration circulates to the families, the bosses who were undecided this morning will have no choice but to align with whoever is operationally present. Victor's empire would not be built on the documents Serafina had laid on that table. It would be built on Dante's absence. Dante stood up. The wound pulled. He made himself stand straight anyway. The financial access, he said. The master key. If Victor declares me dead, what happens to the accounts? Serafina's expression shifted. Something crossing it that he couldn't immediately read. Something that was more than operational calculation. They freeze, she said. For how long? Until the key is entered by an authorized party. He looked at her. You have it, he said. Not a question. Lorenzo gave me the master encryption key 4 years ago, she said. I am the only person outside of Lorenzo's direct knowledge who has it. A pause. Victor doesn't know that. He thinks the accounts revert to organizational control on succession. They don't. They don't. Dante stood in the underground light of the safe house his uncle had built decades ago for exactly this calibration of disaster, with 2 days to surface from the ground and reclaim an empire that had just been legally maneuvered out from under him by his cousin and the woman he'd trusted with access to 3 years of his worst qualities. And he looked at the woman who had apparently been the actual load-bearing wall of the Bellecourt empire since before he'd bothered to understand what that meant. Tell me what we need, he said. She looked at him for a moment, a real look, not operational assessment, something that went down further than that. 48 hours, she said, and someone who can get a message to Pauletti without going through Rome. I can get to Pauletti. And Dante. She held his eyes. When we go back up together. Not you first and me behind, together. He nodded. Together, he said. Outside the tunnel walls, Rome moved through its evening without knowing that 2 of the most consequential people in its criminal architecture were sitting in the dark beneath it, planning the reclamation of everything they'd almost lost. Victor was in the headquarters right now, probably standing in Lorenzo's office with his hand on the desk. Valentina was somewhere in the city with her testimony filed and her new allegiance established, and 3 years of intimate knowledge weaponized and spent. Dante thought about the phone he hadn't answered. He thought about all the things he had not been watching. And then he stopped thinking about the past, because there was no margin left for it. And he looked at Serafina, who was already working, already building the pathway back up into the light, her hands moving with the certainty of someone who had been preparing for the moment when everything fell apart was going to have to be put back together by her hands. They stayed underground for 41 hours, not the 48 Serafina had calculated as the outer limit. They moved on hour 41 because Caruso intercepted a communication through the secondary network that Victor had scheduled a formal address to the assembled family representatives for the following morning. And once that address happened, once Victor stood in front of those men and declared Dante Bellacorte dead and himself the operational head of the syndicate with legal paperwork and a notarized testimony from a credible witness, the window closed. 41 hours was what they had. It was enough. Barely. In those 41 hours, Serafina slept 4 hours total. Dante knew, because he'd watched her, in the way you watch someone when the underground quiet and the low generator hum and the particular intimacy of shared crisis strips away the normal architecture of distance. She worked in 2-hour blocks and then stopped, lay down without ceremony, and was asleep within minutes, and awake again with the same absence of ceremony, sitting up and picking up exactly where she'd stopped. There was nothing performative about it, no display of toughness, just a body being managed with the same precise efficiency she brought to everything else. He slept in pieces. The wound hurt in a dull, persistent way that made deep sleep difficult. He lay in the dark between his fragmented hours and listened to the sound of Caruso moving through the space, the occasional burst of static from the communications equipment, the sound of Serafina's pen on paper when she was working through something she needed to write rather than type. On the second morning underground, hour 31, he came and sat across from her at the communications table, and she pushed a document toward him without looking up. It was a plan, not an outline. A plan, sequenced, timed, contingency branched, written in the dense shorthand she used when she was working fast. He read it twice. The warehouse, he said. Victor is using it for the address tomorrow. He chose it deliberately, the harbor view, the scale of it. He wants the imagery of standing in Bellacourt operational territory and claiming it. She looked up. We let him set the stage. Then we walk onto it. With what army? We don't need an army. She held his eyes. We need Pauletti, Ferrano, and Marchetti in that room when we arrive. And we need the financial system access executed at exactly the right moment. Pauletti confirmed? Last night, Caruso reached him through the secondary contact. He's bringing 2 of the Eastern representatives. A pause. He said, and I want you to know this. He said Lorenzo told him 3 years ago that if anything happened during the transition, to watch for Serafina Vale and follow her judgment. Dante sat with that. He told a lot of people to watch for you, Dante said. He told the right people, she said. He looked at her across the table. 41 hours underground, and she had the same straight spine, the same direct eyes, the wound on her hand wrapped in the bandage he'd put on it, her dress exchanged for clothes Caruso had retrieved from the car, dark trousers, a plain shirt, and she looked nothing like the woman in the oversized sweaters he'd spent years looking through. He wondered, not for the first time in those 41 hours, whether those sweaters had been deliberate, whether the glasses, the pulled-back hair, the extreme quiet at dinner tables, whether all of it had been a specific choice, the way certain animals are indistinguishable from their environment until the moment they decide not to be. I thought it probably had been. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked at him steadily. For which part? For looking through you, for 3 years. He said it flat, without decoration. He'd thought about how to say it during the night hours and decided that decoration was an insult to the thing he was trying to say. You were doing the most important work in the organization, and I categorized you as background. It was wrong. Serafina was quiet for a moment. Lorenzo said you'd get there, she said. He said that. He said it would take a crisis of sufficient scale. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but close to one, the kind that lives in the corners before it decides whether to expand. He was optimistic about the timeline. Dante almost laughed. The situation did not feel like something that allowed laughter, and he almost did it anyway. We go at dawn, he said. Dawn, she agreed. He went to rest his eyes for an hour, and this time he actually slept. And when he woke, it was because Serafina had put her hand on his shoulder and said his name once. And in the half-second before full consciousness, he thought, clearly, without ambiguity, That the sound of his name and her voice was something he did not want to stop hearing. He filed that away and got up. The warehouse district on Rome's harbor edge had a particular quality in the pre-dawn hours. Immense, industrial, the smell of salt water and diesel and old cargo. The sounds of the port beginning its morning machinery a kilometer away, close enough to hear, but far enough that the sounds arrived abstracted, stripped of their sources. The Bellecourt warehouse was the largest in the family's operational portfolio, a converted cargo facility that handled legitimate freight as its surface function and had been used for organizational gatherings since Lorenzo had acquired it 20 years ago. Victor had chosen it the way conquerors choose landmarks. The statement was architectural. They arrived at 5:47 a.m. Caruso drove. The city was still mostly dark, the eastern horizon just beginning the first gray suggestion of dawn, the harbor water moving in flat black sheets. Dante sat in the front, Serafina sat in the back with her phone and the folder, always the folder. And when they pulled into the access road that ran along the warehouse's north side, she looked up and said, "Pauletti's people are at the south entrance. You can see them." "I can see their car," she said. "I told him the south entrance specifically." Dante looked at the building. The lights were on inside, visible through the high clerestory windows, that particular flat quality of industrial fluorescence that makes everything inside look like it's being examined. Victor had arrived early, or never left. There were two of his security people visible at the main entrance. More inside, certainly. "How many of his people do you estimate?" Dante asked Caruso. The communication intercept suggested he moved 8 to the warehouse yesterday, plus the 3 who were in the convoy that hit us on the road. One of those vehicles didn't return to the Rome contact sightline last night. Caruso's voice was steady. "Call it 10 to 12. "And we have 3, Caruso said. Dante looked at Serafina. "We don't need to win the room with force," she said. "We need to be in the room when the accounts freeze. The moment the money disappears, his security stops having a reason to be loyal. There's a window between us walking in and the accounts freezing where Victor has 12 armed men and we have none." "Yes," she said. "That's the part that requires you." He looked at her. "Me. You walk in first," she said, alone, visibly alive. Before he can process the tactical situation, the narrative has already changed. You're not dead. The death declaration is void. Everything he told those family bosses this morning collapses in real time. She held his eyes. He'll want to talk before he moves. He'll want to understand what you know and what you have. Men like Victor always want that. Men like Victor have 12 armed personnel. Men like Victor are also standing in front of Pauletti and Ferrano and 4 other family bosses who are going to be watching very carefully how he reacts to a man he just declared dead, walking through the door alive. Her voice was precise and certain and slightly relentless. If he moves violently in that room, in front of those witnesses, he's finished. He knows that. He'll talk. And while he's talking, "I access the system," she said. 2 minutes, that's all I need. The building was in front of them. The gray dawn was getting less gray. Dante made himself breathe slowly, made himself feel the weight of the wound in his side and the 41 hours of tunnel air in his lungs and the specific texture of the moment, its irreversibility, its requirement. He thought about Lorenzo, who had built this entire contingency from the ground up and placed Serafina at the center of it like a keystone, who had understood that the Empire's survival ultimately came down not to bloodline or firepower, but to the particular combination of intelligence and nerve that he'd recognized in an 8-year-old girl and cultivated for 16 years. "Okay," Dante said. He got out of the car. The warehouse doors were steel, industrial, 12 feet high. The 2 security men at the entrance were Victor's. Dante recognized one of them, a broad-shouldered man named Grieco, who'd been in organizational security for 6 years, who looked at Dante now with an expression that went through surprise, recalculation, and the specific blankness of a professional trying to determine which set of orders currently applied. "Grieco," Dante said. "Mr. Bellecourt." The voice was careful. "I'm going inside." A pause. The 2 men looked at each other. Grieco had a radio on his belt and the specific stillness of a man deciding whether to use it. "Mr. Victor there's a gathering in progress." "I know," Dante said. "I'm attending." He walked between them. They let him. The calculus was too complicated for the door. A man declared dead walking upright and calm was a problem that needed to go up the chain, not be resolved at the entrance. Inside, the warehouse had been arranged for the address. A central floor space cleared, the family representatives seated in a configuration that suggested both meeting and audience. Victor stood at the far end near a raised platform that hadn't been there before, newly constructed or brought in, the kind of improvised stage that men use when they want their elevation to be literal as well as figurative. Around the walls, positioned at intervals with the deliberate visibility of a show of force, Victor's security people. Dante counted 10. He walked into the space and the sound changed. Not loudly, a shift in the quality of ambient noise as the assembled people became aware of him, a ripple of attention moving through the room. He walked steadily, not fast, not slow, the way his uncle had walked into rooms, like the room's geometry had been arranged around him. Victor saw him. The distance between them was 30 meters, and Dante watched his cousin's face do something he had never seen it do in 34 years, lose its composure completely, just for a second, just a flash of something that was pure animal shock before the mask came back down. It came back down fast. Victor was good, but Dante had seen it. He stopped in the center of the floor. "Victor," he said. His voice carried in the warehouse acoustics. Everyone heard it. "Dante." Victor's voice was controlled, careful, finding its footing. "You look terrible." "I was shot at on a public road," Dante said. "It tends to leave marks." Murmur through the assembled bosses. Pauletti, in the third row, was watching with an expression of careful attention. Ferrano beside him. Marchetti at the end. They were all watching Victor now, with the particular quality of men who have just realized that the information they were presented this morning may have required revision. Victor stepped down from the platform. He moved toward Dante, and the security people around the room shifted, not moving, but adjusting their weight, a subliminal reconfiguration. And Dante made himself stand still and hold his cousin's gaze across the diminishing distance. Victor stopped 6 feet away. "You should have stayed underground," Victor said, quiet enough that only Dante could hear it. "You should have built something worth having," Dante said back, "instead of spending 3 years taking what someone else built." Something moved through Victor's eyes. Not fear, not yet. Rage, the specific kind that comes from being accurately described. "The filing is legal," Victor said. "Valentina's testimony is notarized. You have no standing." "I'm standing here," Dante said. That tends to complicate the incapacitation argument. Behind him, in the far corner he'd noted when he entered, a secondary door, a cable junction point, the specific location Serafina had identified from the building schematics Caruso had pulled the night before. He heard nothing. He would hear nothing. She moved like water when she chose to. He needed 90 more seconds. "The accounts," Victor said, and his voice had changed, lower, more specific. He'd done the calculation. He was doing it now. "You think you can freeze the accounts. That's what she's here for." He looked past Dante toward the back of the room. "Your wife." "My wife isn't here," Dante said. "Don't." Victor took a step closer. The 6 feet became 4. "I know what Lorenzo gave her. I've known for 2 years. I couldn't find the key, but I knew he'd given it to her." His jaw was tight. "Where is she, Dante?" "I told you. Where is she?" The voice cracked on the second word, the composure splitting along the line of genuine desperation. Around the room, the security personnel were getting the signal. Victor's hand at his side, a small motion, the prearranged instruction for enclosure. 45 seconds. "You want to do this in front of them?" Dante said, gesturing to the assembled bosses without taking his eyes off Victor. "Pauletti, Ferrano, Marchetti. You want these men to watch you?" "I want the key," Victor said, "and I will take it however I have to." "You'll take nothing," Dante said, and then the lights went out. Not all of them. The emergency lighting kicked in after a 2-second gap, red-tinted, industrial, casting the warehouse in the specific quality of emergency light that makes everything look like a choice has been made that cannot be unmade. In the 2 seconds of complete darkness, Dante dropped and moved left, the way Caruso had told him to. If the lights go, go left. Stay low. Don't stop. And he heard the sound of controlled chaos behind him, Victor's voice barking orders, the security personnel trying to reorient, the family bosses on their feet. The lights came back. Emergency only, red and flat. Serafina was standing at the cable junction in the corner, her phone in her hand, the financial access interface on the screen, and she looked up at Victor across the warehouse with an expression that was completely calm. "It's done," she said. Victor looked at her. "Every account connected to your operation is frozen," she said. Her voice carried in the emergency quiet. "Every transfer, every payroll disbursement, every financial instrument. Your security people have not been paid as of 60 seconds ago and will not be paid until I release the authorization, which will happen when you surrender operational control." She paused. "The men you hired don't work for ideas. They work for money, and the money is gone." The security personnel around the room were doing the specific calculation she'd described, checking phones, looking at each other, the loyalty math running in real time. Victor took 3 steps toward her. Dante was already moving. He crossed the warehouse floor and put himself between Victor and Serafina, and they were close now, close enough to see every detail of his cousin's face, the sweat at his temple, the specific wild quality of a man who has just watched everything he spent 3 years building dissolve in 60 seconds, and who has, in his desperation, stopped calculating consequences. Victor reached inside his jacket. Dante saw it. Everything in his body understood it before his mind did. The specific motion, the specific intention. "Don't," Dante said. Victor pulled the gun. He didn't aim at Dante. He aimed past him, at Serafina, and the warehouse froze. And in the frozen moment, Dante saw on his cousin's face the thing that desperation does to men who have never truly lost before. It strips them past calculation, past strategy, past everything they built on top of the animal underneath. And what's left is just the animal, just the rage, just the gun pointed at the woman who had, in 60 seconds, taken everything he had built from him. Dante moved without deciding to. That was the only way to describe it afterward. Not a choice, not a calculation, just the body doing what it had already committed to before the mind caught up. He stepped left and forward simultaneously, inside Victor's arm, and his left hand came up and took Victor's wrist, and his right elbow drove into his cousin's jaw, and the gun discharged into the warehouse ceiling with a sound like the building had been split open, plaster dust and the ringing echo of it filling the space. And then Victor was down and Dante was on top of him with one knee on his chest and his hand around his cousin's wrist, grinding the gun loose from his grip. The wound in his side tore. He felt it, a white, specific pain that was entirely distinct from the dull ache of the previous 40 hours. A tearing sensation that meant the sutures had given way, and he registered it and he stayed on Victor's chest, and he pressed his cousin's gun hand to the floor until the fingers opened. The gun skidded across the concrete. The warehouse was frozen. Emergency lights still red. The assembled family bosses on their feet. Victor's security personnel. And this was the thing Serafina had understood and built the entire plan around. We're not moving. Not because they were incapable of it, but because their phones were showing them empty accounts. And the math was finished. It had been finished since the lights came back. And men who sell their service for money do not die for a man whose money has disappeared. Victor was breathing hard beneath him. The jaw was swelling already from the elbow, his eyes, and Dante was looking directly into them from 12 inches away, were doing something Dante had never seen in them across 34 years of shared family, of competition, of the particular grinding resentment Victor had been carrying since before Dante could name what it was. They were wet, not crying, not yet, just wet, the specific liquid of a man who has hit the wall at the end of everything he'd been running toward and found it solid. "It's over," Dante said. His voice came out rough, stripped down, not the controlled register he'd walked in with. Just the voice he had left after 41 hours underground and a torn wound and his cousin on the floor under him. Victor's jaw worked. "You don't—" He stopped, started again. "You don't deserve it. Maybe not," Dante said. "But here we are." He got off him, stood up. The wound pulled viciously, and he let it show on his face because there was no one in the room left to perform for. He looked at Caruso, who had come through the side entrance during the chaos, and was now standing 6 feet away with the specific readiness of a man who had been in this industry long enough to know when a situation had resolved and when it was still resolving. "Get him up," Dante said. Caruso moved. 2 of the family representatives' security people, Pauletti's men, moved with him. Victor was lifted from the floor, and he did not resist, which was more devastating to watch than resistance would have been. The complete absence of fight in a man who had run 3 years of patient, meticulous, dangerous ambition. Dante turned to look at Serafina. She was exactly where she'd been. Against the wall, phone still in hand, the financial interface still open on the screen. She was looking at him with an expression that had too many things in it to catalog quickly. Relief, and something older than relief. Something that had been compressed for a very long time and was only now finding enough space to exist. She looked at his side. The jacket was dark again. "You tore it," she said. "I noticed." "You need—" "I know what I need." He crossed the warehouse floor to her. Around them, the room was beginning to move our gammon. The bosses, the security personnel making their quiet recalibrations, Caruso managing the logistics of what came next. He stopped in front of her. "Are you hurt?" "No." "You're sure?" "Yes." She looked up at him. "You moved very fast." "You made a plan that required me to move fast." "I made a plan that required you to be willing to," she said. "I didn't know for certain that you were." He held her eyes. "I was," he said. She nodded once, looked back at her phone. Released the account freeze on the legitimate family accounts, a specific authorization that restored operations without restoring Victor's private structures, a distinction she'd apparently built into the freeze architecture in advance. He watched her hands move through it and thought about the level of preparation required to think clearly enough, under the pressure of an ambush on a rain-slicked road, to build that distinction in, to maintain that separation. "Done," she said. Paletti was at Dante's elbow. "You look like hell," Paletti said. "I've heard," Dante said. "The filing Victor made this morning." Paletti glanced toward where Caruso was managing Victor, then back. "It will need to be formally voided. I can support that process with 2 of the Eastern representatives, given what we witnessed today." "I'd appreciate that." Paletti looked at Serafina with the specific quality of assessment he'd been deploying since the gathering dinner. "The accounts. She controls them." "She controls the master key," Dante said. "That's how my uncle arranged it, and that's how it stays." A pause. Paletti absorbed this with the face of a man doing complex arithmetic in public. "Your uncle," he said finally, "was a very careful man." "Yes," Dante said, "he was." Paletti looked at Serafina again. She met his gaze with the directness that seemed to be her neutral state. Not challenging, not deferential, just present and clear-eyed and steady, in a way that most people in this industry learn to perform, and she appeared to simply be. "Mrs. Bellecourt," Paletti said. "Mr. Paletti," she said. He nodded once, with the specific weight of a man who has just updated something fundamental in how he understands a situation. Then he went to speak to Ferrano. Dante looked at his side. "I need to sit down," he said. "I know," Serafina said. "Come on." There was a back office in the warehouse, a working space, with a scarred desk and 2 chairs and a window that looked out over the harbor water, which was going from black to the particular dark gray of early morning. Serafina sat him down and reopened the wound and resutured it with the second medical kit Caruso produced from somewhere, and she worked in silence and he let her, watching the harbor through the window while her hands moved. The sounds of the warehouse filtered through the wall. The gradual deconstruction of Victor's arrangements, the voices of the bosses, the particular bureaucratic weight of consequences being administered. "He'll be processed through the family council," Dante said. "Yes." "The account structures will need to be untangled. The Croatian contractor will need to be terminated formally. I have the documentation for both. Ferry can file the council charges with what I provided at the gathering." She tied off the last suture. "The Croatian situation is more delicate. The contractor has a relationship with 2 other families. It needs to be handled through channels, not unilaterally." "Can you handle it?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He watched her repack the medical kit with the same efficiency she brought to everything. She was tired. He could see it now in the specific way her movements had slowed. Not in their precision, but in their speed. The body running on the last fuel at the bottom of the tank. "Valentina," she said. She said it without inflection, but deliberately, the way you say a name when you've been waiting to say it. "What about her?" "She filed notarized testimony to have you declared incapacitated. That's actionable, legally, and operationally. The family council will want to know how you're handling it." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the harbor. "I know," he said. "Dante." "I know," he said again, different weight this time. I'm not I'm not going to pretend it's a simple thing. 3 years. He stopped. I made her possible. I gave her everything she needed and didn't ask any questions about what she was doing with it. You trusted her. I used her, he said. The words landed hard in the room, and he let them. I used her for what was convenient, and I didn't look at what she was beyond that. That's on me. He turned from the window to look at Serafina. Same as I used everyone, same as I looked through you. Same pattern, different person. He held her gaze. I'm aware of that. She looked at him for a long moment. She still chose to file the testimony, she said. People make their own choices. Yes, but I created the conditions. He was quiet. The council will deal with the legal question. The rest of it I'll carry myself. She nodded. She understood the distinction. Outside, the harbor water was lightening, the first real gray of dawn coming up behind the city, the skyline beginning to separate from the sky. What Lorenzo told you, Dante said. Keep him alive. Change that. He was looking at the window. You did both. The first one was easier, she said. He turned to look at her. She wasn't quite smiling, but the corners of it were there. I'm aware, he said. The almost smile held for a moment. Then she looked down at her hands, at the bandage on the left one, at the residue of the last 41 hours that was in her skin and her posture and the shadows under her eyes. What happens now, she said. Not strategically, not operationally, just the question itself, the simple human version of it, asked quietly in a back office with the harbor going gray outside. Dante sat with it. The council meeting will be in 3 weeks, he said. Victor's situation gets formally processed, charges filed, assets properly frozen through legal channels. The regional lieutenants will want a meeting. I'll need to spend the first month doing the circuit, establishing presence, letting people see that the transition is real and stable. He paused. The legitimate holdings need a structural review. There's been a decade of incremental growth and not enough consolidation. I want to move more of the financial base into legal infrastructure. He looked at her. I'll need you for that. I know. Not as background, he said. Not as the person nobody looks at. I need you in the actual rooms. She was quiet for a moment. That changes things, she said. It changes everything, he said. That's the point. She looked at him with the expression she had when she was processing something that had more weight than its surface suggested. The slight tension at her brow, the specific stillness. He let her process it. Lorenzo wanted that, she said finally. He didn't think you'd get there this fast. I had a very compressed education, Dante said. This time she did smile. Not a corner of one. An actual smile, brief and unguarded, and entirely different from every other expression he'd cataloged in the months of watching her across tables and corridors and lamplight, and it hit him somewhere specific, somewhere he'd been not looking at since the dinner table, and the almost joke and the candlelight in the tunnel, and he made himself hold still and not look away. I need to sleep, she said. Yes. More than 4 hours this time. I'll arrange it. She stood up. He stood up with her. They were close in the small space of the office, closer than the available geometry strictly required, and neither of them adjusted for it. Dante, she said. I know, he said. She looked at him. I haven't said anything yet, she said. I know what you were going to say. Do you? You were going to say that what happened in the tunnel, the proximity, the circumstances, the compressed intensity of everything. You were going to say that it shouldn't be mistaken for something it might not be. That decisions made underground in crisis conditions deserve time and distance before they're treated as real. He held her eyes. You were going to say that carefully because you're careful with things that matter. She was very still. And? She said. And you're right, he said. So we'll take the time. We'll do the work in front of us. We'll be in the rooms together and we'll build what Lorenzo started and we'll do it properly. He paused. And then we'll see. She looked at him for a long moment. That's the most patient thing I've ever heard you say, she said. I'm trying something new. She turned and walked to the door. At the door she stopped, her hand on the frame, her back still partly to him. For what it's worth, she said. The man Lorenzo described to me, the one he said was in there underneath everything. I've seen him, the last 2 days. She paused. He was worth waiting for. She went out. Dante stood in the empty office with the harbor going gold outside the window, the first real light breaking across the water, And he breathed in and breathed out and felt the wound in his side and the exhaustion in his legs, and the specific weight of a man who has just come through the thing that was going to either end him or change him, and understood for the first time with real clarity which one it had been. The months that followed were not easy. Easy would have been the wrong shape for what they were trying to build. The family council processed Victor's case over 6 weeks. The charges were significant: financial theft, conspiracy to commit violence, the attempted assassination on the public road, the fraudulent filing. The assembled bosses had been in that warehouse. They had seen the gun. They had seen the accounts freeze and the security personnel stand down, and the architecture of Victor's 3-year operation dismantled in 60 seconds by a woman with a phone. There was no sympathy to be found, and no procedural ambiguity worth exploiting. Victor received a sentence that the council's mechanisms were designed to enforce, and he received it in a room where Dante did not speak for him and did not speak against him, and when it was done, Dante walked out of the building and did not look back. The regional circuit took 4 weeks. Dante made every meeting, every dinner, every uncomfortable room where men who had realigned after Victor's brief seizure needed to see him stand in front of them and demonstrate the specific quality of presence that holds organizational loyalty together. Not force, not charm, but the particular credibility of someone who has been through something and come out the other side with their spine intact. He brought Serafina to every meeting that mattered, which was all of them. He introduced her not as his wife, they all knew she was his wife, but as his partner, with the exact weight that word carried when it was used precisely in this context. The men who'd underestimated her adjusted their estimates. The men who'd already understood who she was received confirmation that the structure had been correctly identified. The legitimate holdings review took 3 months and produced a restructuring plan that Serafina had largely pre-built in the archive files, working from the framework Lorenzo had started and never completed. Dante worked through it with her line by line, which required the kind of sustained financial attention he had historically avoided. He did not avoid it now. He asked questions when he didn't understand, and she answered them without condescension and without performing patience. Just answered them the way you answer questions from someone you expect to understand eventually. Understood eventually. There was one conversation about Valentina. It happened on an ordinary evening in the apartment he'd maintained on Via Condotti, and was in the process of closing, clearing out the last items, the final administrative pieces. Serafina was there because they'd come from a meeting together, and he'd needed to collect some documents. She stood in the main room while he went through the desk drawers, and he found, in the back of the bottom drawer, a photograph. He stood there looking at it for a moment, and then put it face down on the desk. "You don't have to not look at it," Serafina said. He turned. She was across the room, looking at him with the directness that still, 6 months in, could stop him mid-thought. "I know," he said. "She was part of your life for 3 years. That's real, regardless of how it ended." He looked at the photograph face down on the desk. "She testified that I was incapacitated," he said. "Substance dependent, unfit." "I know what she testified. Some of it wasn't false," he said. He said it quietly. He'd been carrying it for 6 months in the specific way that real things get carried, not front and center, but present, showing up in the details of self-examination. "I wasn't dependent, but the rest of it, the carelessness, the years of running from anything that required me to sit still and look at what I was doing, she had material, because I gave it to her." Serafina crossed the room. She stood beside him at the desk. "You gave it to her because you didn't think it mattered," she said. "Because you didn't think the consequences would reach you." "Yes. And now you know they do." "Now I know they do." He looked at her. "That's the difference. That's the whole difference." She picked up the photograph from the desk, looked at it briefly, and set it back down. "Close the apartment," she said. "Come home." He looked at her. The word she had used, home, sat in the air between them with the particular weight of a word that has shifted in meaning gradually and arrived somewhere different from where it started. The mansion had been a building where they occupied opposite ends. It had become, over months of morning briefings and working sessions and dinners, that had stopped being performances and started being something else, something more specific. A place they both came back to and both left from, a center. "Serafina," he said. She looked up at him. He said, "I don't want to take the time anymore." She was very still. "The tunnel," he said. "The office. The last 6 months." He was careful with the words. the way she'd taught him to be careful with things that mattered. I know what it is. I'm not asking you to take it on faith. I'm asking you to tell me what you know. She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside, Rome moved through its evening, ancient and indifferent and continuous, the city that had watched 1,000 versions of this story and would watch 1,000 more. I know, she said, that Lorenzo was right about you. Is that enough? She reached up and took his face in her hands. The careful hands that had sutured his wounds and built his financial architecture and dismantled his cousin's empire in 60 seconds. And she looked at him for one more long moment, the way she looked at everything, fully and without flinching. Ask me again, she said, and see. He did. The announcement was made at the spring gathering, in Ferrano's villa again, the same room where 7 months earlier Serafina had laid documents on the table and changed the shape of an empire. Dante stood at the head of the room and said what needed to be said. The structural changes, the new operational direction, the consolidation of legitimate holdings. And then he said the part that the assembled men had perhaps anticipated and perhaps had not. He announced a new structure of operational authority. 2 principles. Equal standing, not heir and advisor, not principal and partner in the soft sense, but 2 equal authorities with distinct domains of responsibility, whose combined judgment constituted organizational decision. He named Serafina. The room was quiet. Pauletti, in the second row, was the first to incline his head. Ferrano followed. Then the room, in the gradual, irreversible way that rooms move, when something has been said that reconfigures their understanding of what is real. Serafina sat beside Dante and did not perform humility and did not perform triumph. She sat the way she always sat, straight, present, clear-eyed, her hands folded on the table in front of her. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been doing this work since before most of the men in the room had considered her worth addressing, and who had arrived at this moment not through fortune or marriage or the goodwill of men who understood her, but through the sustained, meticulous, irreplaceable work of someone who had always known exactly what she was capable of and had been patient enough to wait for the world to catch up. Lorenzo Bellacourt had understood it when she was 8 years old, sitting in a courtroom where adults were deciding her future, asking precise questions and listening to the answers with the focused attention of someone filing them for later use. He had built an empire around that understanding, and left it, in the end, to the 2 people most likely to deserve it. The man who had needed to be broken down before he could be built into something worth being, and the woman who had understood from the beginning that that was exactly what was required. Dante looked at her across the table. She looked back. Between them, no disguises, no distance, no more architecture of pretense. Just 2 people who had been through the particular kind of fire that either destroys everything or reveals what was worth keeping, and had come out holding what mattered. Outside the villa, Rome was green with spring, the hills running long and soft in the afternoon light, the city's distant rooftops warm with sun. The ancient streets had dried since the winter storms, and the light on the stone was the color of something settling, something old finding its new configuration. The empire Lorenzo had built would change now, was already changing. Not everything he'd built would survive the change. Some of it wasn't worth surviving, but the bones of it, the real structural intelligence at its core, would endure in the form he'd always intended, not in blood or force or the weight of inherited name, but in the particular combination of nerve and clarity and willingness to do the work that he'd recognized in a small, quiet girl and watched, across 16 years, become the most formidable person in any room she occupied. The quiet girl nobody watched. The man who had finally learned to watch. Standing together at the end of the thing, they'd both survived, in the full light, with nothing left to hide. That was the empire. That was the inheritance. That was what remained when everything else burned away.